I'd like to introduce you to an Oxford and Cambridge historian of science. He holds a doctorate in the history of science. James Hannam. He wrote The Genesis of Science, How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution. It might sound counter to what you've heard, especially here on YouTube, except he's actually a historian of science. He has some very serious credentials. It was shortlisted for the Royal Society Science Book Club. It's not like religious groups, in other words, are heaping praise upon him. It's actually secular groups and secular scientific groups, to be specific. Thanks a lot for being with me, Dr. Hannam.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so is it fair to say that most people think that Christianity is an impediment to science, and not only is today, but has been throughout history? Is it a fair assumption to make?
Well, if they're not actually studying the history of science, I think that's what most people think. And that's very unfortunate because, in fact, what's in my book about how the Church helped science, about how Christianity has not been an impediment to science, is not controversial among historians of science. It's something which we in the Academy have known for several decades now. It's just it's never really been accepted by the general public. So that's really why I wrote the book. I just wanted to try and get the story that academic historians have known about for many years out into the domain of the general reader and put that story in a way that people who don't have a background in history or in science can appreciate and enjoy.
All right, then let's cut to the chase. What we most often hear is that Galileo was persecuted by the Church for saying that the Earth went around the sun.
Well, unfortunately, there is certainly some truth behind that. The reason that Galileo was put on trial, however, had rather more to do with papal politics than to do with the actual science. It is true, and this was a catastrophic error by the Catholic Church, that in 1616 it banned saying that the Earth goes around the sun is a fact rather than just a theory or a hypothesis. But Galileo was given to understand by the Pope, who was actually a personal friend of his, that he didn't really have to worry too much about that ban. He could write a book where it was fairly clear what he really thought. But unfortunately, at the end of that book, he got a bit too big for his boots, and he actually insulted the Pope in a way that the Pope himself found wholly unacceptable. A witness said that he exploded with rage, and therefore he demanded that Galileo be put on trial, really as a punishment for his pride. And unfortunately, that meant that the Catholic Church compounded its error of trying to dictate to men of science what they should and should not believe. So that is true, but that's a single instance, a single big mistake that the Church has made throughout a long history, for most of which time it was actually solidly supporting science. And when you ask people to name the scientists who've been persecuted by the Church, they can always name Galileo. They have trouble naming others, largely because essentially there were no others. There were people who were persecuted for heresy, and obviously we should never accept that as being something that the Church was right to do, but it wasn't the case that the Church was holding back science throughout history in the way that it's commonly understood.
But to be fair, I mean, that's a huge thing, right? That a church would say you're not allowed to say that the Earth revolves around the sun. That's pretty huge. It's a big blunder.
You're quite right, yes.
Why'd they do it? Why? If they weren't, anti-science, why did they do it?
Well, in fact, it was simply echoing with what all the main scientists of the day thought. It was totally mainstream science of the day that the Earth is stationary and the sun goes around it. There was really almost no question about that. There were only a few people who, like Galileo, thought differently. Now, those few people turned out to be right, and we should celebrate them for that fact. But the Church wasn't being anti-science when it tried to say that you shouldn't say that the Earth goes around the sun. It was simply echoing what it thought was the best science of the day.
So where did the Church get the bad name vis-a-vis science?
It was started, in fact, as you say, during the Reformation. Protestant writers, such as Sir Francis Bacon, they tried to make out that in the Middle Ages, where, of course, intellectual life had been ruled by the Catholic Church, had been a time of intellectual stagnation and a time of backwardness. And Protestant historians, therefore, were very keen to make out that once countries ceased to be Catholic, then things like science and culture flourished in a way that wasn't possible in the Middle Ages. Galileo, of course, being persecuted by the Catholic Church, almost made him into an honorary Protestant in that sense. And then later on in the Enlightenment, during the 18th century, French philosophers such as Voltaire wanted to attack the Catholic Church because of its political record at the time, as it was in cahoots with the absolute monarchy of France before the French Revolution. You couldn't directly attack the government in France in those days for obvious reasons. So one way to kind of attack the church obliquely was to attack the history of the church.
When exactly in your studies, in the course and timeline of your studies, did you first start suspecting that the public had been misled by way of, Christianity and their scientific reputation, the origin of science?
Well, it was when I picked up a book by David Lindbergh, who is a very distinguished historian of science over in America, called The Beginnings of Western Science. And it really covered the history of science through the ancient Greeks and through the Middle Ages. And it was very interesting that here was a book which gave the Middle Ages as much attention as it did the ancient Greeks.
So we hear so much about the Dark Ages. We hear this wielded, this term, the Dark Ages, the Dark Ages. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Well, it's not a phrase, in fact, you will hear historians use anymore. They will refer to the period 500 AD to 1000 AD as the early Middle Ages because they consider, quite rightly in my opinion, that the Dark Ages is a pejorative term and totally unfair to the period, which was a very important and formative period in European history.
So what's the origin of the term? Who made up the term the Dark Ages then? Do you know?
Well, in fact, this was first happened during the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, it became terribly trendy, terribly popular to believe that all the best literature had been written in ancient Greek and in ancient Latin. And Renaissance humanists denigrated everything which had happened between their own time and the fall of Rome. And they were the first people who started using this term, the Dark Ages. And it was really something which I think was intended to try and paint themselves as being the continuators, if you like, of ancient Rome, and everything that happened in between as an interruption. But we now know that what happened in between was tremendously important. And in fact, I think that the humanists were quite a conservative and reactionary bunch because they were trying to bring about the rebirth of the ancient world rather than trying to move forward.